In Analysis Engine, all assets have associated with them a set of permissions that determines what users have access to do what with that particular asset. In this tutorial, we'll look at what permission levels are available in Analysis Engine, how permissions are applied to users and teams, and how to use permissions to carefully decide who has access to what Google Analytics data. By assets, I mean data imports and exports, connections, and Google and Bing Ads accounts. Permissions are used by the owners of the asset and can be assigned to specific users or to teams of users. There are 5 permission levels in Analysis Engine. First, you can have no permissions on an asset. This means that you can't see the asset listed in Analysis Engine at all, and you can't get to the asset by a URL either. It also means that you can't use any of the data imports or data exports that depend on this asset. For instance, you can't run a data export if you don't have any permissions on the connection it uses. Second, you can have execute permissions on an asset. With execute permissions, you still can't see the asset listed in your account, but you can use the asset in certain contexts. For example, if you have execute permissions on a connection and the Google account behind it, you can run any data export that uses that connection. You can also run data exports that you have execute permissions on using Reporting Manager in Microsoft Excel, if the Excel file you're working with already has a link to that data export as a reporting event. Third, you can have read permissions on an asset. With read permissions, you can see the asset listed in Analysis Engine and view its details, but you can't modify it at all. You can, however, use it. For example, if you have read permissions on a connection, you can create new data imports and exports that use that connection. Fourth, you can have write permissions on an asset. With write permissions, you can do everything you could do with read and execute permissions, but you can also make changes to the asset. However, you still can't delete it, and you can't control the permissions other people have on it. For that, you need the highest level of permissions, owner permissions. If you're an owner of an asset, you can do everything with the asset, including read-write operations, using the asset, and deleting it. You also have control over the asset's permissions as an owner, and you can assign permissions on the asset to other users. Permissions can be assigned to users, but they can also be assigned to teams. When permissions are assigned to a team of users, every user in the team gets access to them automatically. When a user is removed from a team, they lose asset permissions that were granted to them from that team. A user has the highest level of permissions on an asset granted to them individually or through a team. So, a user with execute permissions on a data export that also belongs to a team with read permissions on the same export effectively has read permissions on the export. The team extends the user's permissions. On the other hand, a user with write permissions on a data export that belongs to a team that only has read permissions on the same export effectively still has write permissions on the export. The team does not demote the user's permissions. In Analysis Engine, permissions on certain types of assets affect what you can do with the other assets that depend on them. In general, this happens through connections. Owners of Google accounts and connections have complete control over who has access to what Google Analytics data. This means that your data is secure and can be shared without creating new accounts in Google Analytics or inviting new users into Google Analytics itself. What does this look like in practice? Let's consider the case of data exports. If a user wants to run a data export, they will need permissions on the data export, the connection used by that data export, and the Google account that is used by that connection. If they don't have at least execute permissions on each of the above, the user can't run the data export. Consider the following cases. If a user has read permissions on a data export, but does not have permissions on the connection or the Google account, he or she cannot run the data export. If a user has execute permissions on a data export, its connection and its Google account, he or she can run the data export through Reporting Manager if they know the data export ID or the Microsoft Excel file that they're working with already has been configured to use that data export. However, the same user cannot create a new data export with the same connection or edit the data export to access any data that isn't already set up in its definition. If a user has execute permissions on a connection and the Google account it uses, he or she can run a data export that uses it, but they can't make new data exports using that connection because it isn't listed in Analysis Engine when they go to make a new data export. If a user has read permissions on a connection, they can see the connection and the list of properties and views that are contained in it, if the connection is to Google Analytics. But if they only have execute permissions on the Google account used by that connection, they cannot see the list of the other properties or views that the same Google account has access to, nor can they create new connections with access to the same Google account. With this level of control, as the owner of a Google account, an administrator can carefully provision access to only specific views or even specific data points to users that need them, and keep the rest of the data locked away safely.